The Return of Marx sounds a bit like a horror film title, doesn't it? You know, the Mummy Returns or something. And I suppose it is a bit of a horror story for those who don't like the resurgence of the political left. But that is happening, interestingly, and I want to begin by just asking why that's the case. Just last year I published a remarkably cheap and extraordinarily attractive book called Why Marx is Right, on sale from all good booksellers, but alas, not at the back of the hall here. And to my astonishment, for about a precious 2 or 3 days, this book was number 8 on Amazon's list of best-selling business books. Yes. Now, you know, bankers must be pretty desperate when they take to reading me. You know, maybe they'll be into literary theory next, you know, discussing hermeneutical phenomenology and so on. Why is that happening? I mean, the book very rapidly fell down in the league tables, but why is that happening? Well, it's not so much, I suppose, they want to know about Marx. They're worried about capitalism, yes? And they know that Marx has a lot to say about that. It's incidentally, I think, a sign that things are really serious when capitalists start using the word capitalism, as they have done, you know, over the past 3 or 4 years. I mean, it's all right to talk about, you know, the free market or liberal democracy or free enterprise, the free world, but they really shouldn't do that because, of course, the whole point of capitalism is that it's supposed to be as natural as the air we breathe. It's the invisible color of everyday life. It's too close to the eyeball to be properly objectified. But what happens, of course, in a crisis is exactly that. What happens in a crisis is that the system which is previously invisible becomes newly perceptible. And I think that's one thing that's happened, and one reason why capitalists are unwisely using the word capitalism. It's an effect of a crisis, I think, among other things, that it serves to denaturalize the system. In other words, it serves to make our form of life perceptible as a determinate system. It serves to frame, name, distance, objectify, and historicize a particular way of life. And that historicization in particular is rather dangerous, I think, because what was born can always die. Crisis makes the system newly perceptible, and that, you might say, the framing, naming, objectifying, distancing of this otherwise rather amorphous way of life is exactly the major achievement of Marx. Quite a lot of what Marx said wasn't at all original to him. Revolution wasn't original, communism wasn't original, not even modes of production, which was well known to the 18th century Enlightenment. But to actually isolate the mechanisms and laws by which a particular system worked, to, as it were, delimit this as a system, was one of his major achievements. It may be, of course, that some people think that putting in a good word for Marx is as perverse as putting in a good word for Jack the Ripper. In fact, it suddenly occurred to me that maybe Marx was Jack the Ripper. It's about the only theory of Jack the Ripper that hasn't yet been advanced. Maybe he slipped out of the back of the British Library from time to time. I mean, weren't Marx's ideas responsible for despotism, mass murder, labor camps, economic crisis, the loss of liberty for millions of men and women? Wasn't one of his most devoted disciples a paranoid Georgian peasant, and another a brutal Chinese dictator who may have had the blood of some 30 million people on his hands? Well, I think the truth is, of course, that Marx was no more responsible for the monstrous oppression of the communist world than Jesus was responsible for the Inquisition. For one thing, of course, as many people know, I'm not telling you anything new here, would of course have scorned the idea that socialism could take root in desperately backward, impoverished conditions like Russia and China. If it did, then the result would be simply what he called generalized scarcity, It would mean a recycling simply of what he called the old filthy business, or in rather less tasteful translation, the same old crap. Marxism, of course, is a theory of how well-heeled capitalist nations can use their immense resources to achieve justice and prosperity for all of their people. It's not a program by which nations bereft of material resources, without a flourishing civic culture, a democratic heritage, a well-evolved technology, enlightened liberal traditions, and a skilled, educated workforce, can catapult themselves into the modern age from that chronically backward position. They can do so indeed with the help of more advanced nations. But if they try it alone, then they're very likely to end up with some species of Stalinism. There's a sense in which I suppose the whole of Marx's writing boils down to a single rather embarrassing question. Why is it that the capitalist West has accumulated more resources than history has ever witnessed, yet appears powerless to overcome poverty, starvation, inequality, and so on? What are the mechanisms by which affluence for a minority seems to breed hardship and indignity for the majority? Why does private wealth seem to go hand in hand with public squalor? Is it, as the good-hearted reformist suggests, that we simply haven't got round to mopping up these pockets of human misery, or is it more plausible to maintain there's something in the very nature of capitalism which generates deprivation and inequality as surely as Charlie Sheen generates controversy and trouble? Marx was the first thinker to talk in these terms, as Darwin was the first to explain how we emerged from nature. In the work of this sort of down-at-heel émigré Jew, a man who once remarked that nobody had ever written so much about money and had so little, this Jew bequeathed to us for the first time the language in which the system under which we live can be grasped as a whole. Its contradictions were analysed, its inner dynamics laid bare. That's not, of course, for a moment to suggest that Marx considered capitalism was simply a bad thing, like admiring Sarah Palin or blowing tobacco smoke in your children's faces. On the contrary, he was extravagant in his praise for the class which created the capitalist system, a fact that many of his critics and supporters seem to suppress. No other social system in its history, he wrote, had proved so revolutionary. In a mere handful of centuries, the capitalist middle classes had erased almost every trace of their feudal foes from the face of the earth. There are a few embarrassing remnants like Prince Charles and so on that got forgotten in the general sweeping away, but on the whole that was true. They had piled up, in Marx's view, cultural and material treasures. They'd invented human rights, emancipated slaves, toppled autocrats, dismantled empires, fought and died for human freedom, and laid the material basis for a genuinely global civilization. No document lavishes such florid compliments on this mighty historical achievement of the revolutionary middle classes as the Communist Manifesto, not even the Wall Street Journal. This, however, was only part of the story. There are those who see modern history as an enthralling tale of emancipation and progress, and there are those who view it as one long nightmare. Marx, with his usual perversity, thought it was both at the same time. And moreover, one in terms of the other. Every advance in civilization had brought with it new possibilities of barbarism. The great slogans of the revolutionary middle class, liberty, equality, fraternity, were Marx's watchwords too. He had no fancy new ideals to dream up. He simply inquired with a certain kind of faux naivete why these ideals could never be put into practice without violence, poverty, and exploitation. Capitalism, in an enormous irony, and the whole of Marx's work moves under the sign of irony and perversity and paradox. Capitalism had developed human powers and capacities beyond all previous measure. Yet, it had not used these capacities to set men and women free of fruitless toil. On the contrary, it had forced them to labor harder than ever. The richest civilization on earth sweated every bit as hard as their Neolithic ancestors. And Marx is really addressing the question of why all that's true. The way he addresses it, however, doesn't take the form of some kind of dewy-eyed utopianism. On the contrary, Marx begins his political career, in fierce contention with the utopian thinkers around him. He had about as much interest in a perfect human society as Clint Eastwood does, and never once speaks in such terms. He didn't believe that men and women could surpass the Archangel Gabriel in sanctity. Rather, he believed that the world could feasibly be made a considerably better place, and in that I think he was a realist and not an idealist. Those truly with their heads stuck in the sands, the moral ostriches of this world, are those who deny that there can be any radical change. Change might well be for the worse as for the better, but there will certainly be change. They behave, you know, as though Family Guy and multicolored toothpaste and all the rest of it will still be around in the year 4000. If you ask them that, they would say, of course not, you know, but they behave exactly as though, well, and never listen to what people say. Their beliefs are embodied in what they do. The whole of human history is a living disapproval of this viewpoint. Radical change, as I say, may not be for the better. Perhaps the only socialism we shall ever witness is one forced upon the handful of human beings who might crawl out of the other side of a nuclear catastrophe or ecological disaster. Marx himself speaks dually in the Communist Manifesto of the possibility of what he calls the mutual ruin of all parties. A man who witnessed the horrors of industrial capitalist England, who saw that in the making, was unlikely to be starry-eyed about his fellow humans. Marx had, of course, famously little to say about the future. The only image of the future for Marx is the failure of the present. It's a negative image. He's not a prophet in the sense of being a clairvoyant, of peering into a crystal ball. He's a prophet in the more authentic biblical sense. Biblical prophet has nothing to do with looking into the future. It's all to do with warning you that unless you change your unjust ways, the future will either be extremely unpleasant or there won't be a future at all. Socialism, then, isn't utopian, I think, at least Marx's socialism isn't, in the sense that it doesn't depend on some miraculous change in human nature. Some of those who defended feudalism against the early emergence of capitalism in the late Middle Ages preached that capitalism would never work because it was against human nature. Some capitalists now return the same compliment to socialism. No doubt there's somewhere a tribe in the Amazon basin who believe that no social order can survive in which people are allowed to marry their second cousins. Yeah? We all tend to absolutize our own conditions. Socialism, for Marx, there's nothing in Marx to suggest, at least, that socialism would banish rivalry, envy, aggression, possessiveness, domination, and competition from the face of the earth. So socialist society would still have its fair share of bullies, cheats, freeloaders, free riders, occasional psychopaths, Simon Cowells, and so on. You know, it's just that rivalry, aggression, competition, and all that would have to take different kinds of social forms, rather than the form of bankers complaining bitterly that their bonuses have been reduced to a miserly $5 million, while millions of other people in the world struggle to survive on less than $2 a day. Marx was a profoundly moral thinker. I don't mean by that a moralist. It wasn't a matter of moralism. Marx detested moralism. But he speaks famously in the Communist Manifesto, if you remember, of what he calls the free self-development of each as the condition of the free self-development of all. This, I think, is his ultimate ethical and political goal. Socialism would just be whatever set of institutional arrangements made that most possible. And it's an ideal to be approximated. It can't, I think, fully be realized. The free self-development of each as the condition of the free self-development of all. Marx is passionately concerned with the individual. He's deeply skeptical of the abstract. He's a good old romantic humanist as well as an Enlightenment rationalist. He believes in the uniqueness of the concrete, the particular, the specific, the sensuous. That idea permeates his writings from end to end. And his so-called materialism is really all about the human body. Again and again, he speaks of the just society as one in which men and women will be able to realize their distinctive powers and capacities in the fullest, most diverse, and most creative way. And that means that Marx is a moralist in the good old Aristotelian and Thomist and Hegelian sense, that he sees that morality is all about enjoying oneself. It's all about well-being, or eudaimonia, as Aristotle calls it, which sounds a bit like a lung disease. The moral goal is pleasurable self-fulfillment. He's very anti-Kantian in that way. And that, as I say, in that he's at one with his great mentor, Aristotle. I'll be closing in just a minute. Let me just finish by saying, I haven't got a watch, so I have no idea how long I've been going on. 10 minutes? Oh my goodness, I don't even have that much. I don't have that much material. I just have to ad lib. Oh dear. I shouldn't have said that, really. I'll cut out some boring stuff and then move on to something slightly more interesting. Yes, Marx's goal is, of course, leisure and not labour. The best reason for being a socialist, apart from annoying people that you don't like, is that you don't like having to work. It's the only sound reason for being a socialist. Anybody who doesn't like having to work should sign up at the back straight away. Membership cards are ready and waiting for the indolent of this world. Yes. Marx thought that capitalism had developed the forces of production to the point where, differently organized, they could be used to release the majority of men and women from wearisome labor, not from all forms of labor. He was, I think, pretty realistic about that, but from the most degrading kinds of toil. What did he think we would do then? Well, whatever we wanted to do. You know, if, like the great Irish socialist and former student of this college, Oscar Wilde, we would, in Wilde's view, simply as it were, lie around the place all day, you know, in various interesting postures of jouissance, dressed in loose crimson garments, sipping absinthe and reciting Homer to one another. And that would just be the working day, you know, and begin to describe the leisure time there, you know. But Marx, of course, didn't bother to pre-draft that. He had no blueprint for that, because you can't have a blueprint of freedom. You must have a program of how you would put that kind of freedom in place. But Marx refers to everything that's happened to date, that's to say the whole of class society, not as history. He won't even dignify it with the name of history, but as pre-history. Just one more cycle in the dreary round of exploitation. The only truly historic event will be to break with that, and about that, how you do that, you've got to be fairly precise. But once you've done that, there's no way you can prophesy what will happen, because you would inevitably be extrapolating your images of the future from the present, and therefore you wouldn't really have broken with it. I'll miss out a bit about how Marx was once chased by a policeman for breaking a street lamp in the course of a pub crawl, as that's not a very deep theoretical point, really. In fact, he detested the political state even more than the Tea Party does, if for rather more reputable reasons. Was he, one might ask, a Victorian patriarch from a feminist viewpoint? Yes. To be sure, he was a Victorian patriarch. But as some non-Marxist modern commentators have pointed out, it was only men from the socialist and communist camps who, up to the resurgence of the women's movement in the 1960s, regarded the issue of women's equality as vital to other forms of political liberation. The word proletarian, of course, means those in ancient society who were too poor to serve the state with anything but the fruit of their wombs. It means progeny. That's to say, those who could only serve the state by producing labour power for it in the form of children. Yes. Proles means offspring, and today, in the sweatshops and on the small farms of the third world, the typical proletarian is still a woman. Much the same goes for ethnic matters. In the 1920s and 30s, practically the only men and women to be found preaching racial equality were communists. Most anti-colonial movements were, of course, deeply inspired by Marxism. The anti-socialist thinker von Mises described socialism as the most powerful reform movement that history has ever known. The first ideological trend not limited to a section of mankind, but supported by people of all races, nations, religions, and civilizations. Marx, who knew his history, might have reminded von Mises of Christianity, but the point remains forceful. As for the environmental politics, Marx astonishingly prefigured our own ecological politics. Astonishingly so, as this remarkably cheap and attractive book of mine, Why Marx Was Right, in a certain chapter, argues in brilliant and forceful detail. The need to regard nature as an ally rather than an antagonist is one of his constant preoccupations. I've said that one of the reasons why Marx is back on the agenda is really capitalism. If you think back to about 2000, only as recently as 2000, it was as though, in a sense, history had become frozen, pickled in aspic, arrested in what looked like a certain permanent posture. It was the age of the death of history. We were told that no significant historical events would now happen, certainly nothing historic. Yeah? The age was now post-historical, post-metaphysical, post-theological, post-modernist. Yeah? And then the World Trade Center bit the dust. Yes. And since then, it's been a matter of having far too much history than too little. The war in Iraq, the so-called war on terror, the outbreak of an enormous global capitalist crisis, the Arab Spring, and so on, all of which events are subtly interconnected, suddenly moved apace. And as in the thrilling years before the Bolshevik Revolution, so much history was happening that theory had to hobble pretty hard to catch up with it. We still haven't really done that. But Marx is back on the agenda. Has his work defects? Oh, hundreds of them. Yes, absolutely. Not least in my view, and I'm a bit of a heretic here, the thing that I think is most original and peculiar to Marx, his thought, is also, I think, what is most problematical about it. And that is, well, if you want to see me later after this, just for a very small fee, I'll let you know. So there is a great deal that's problematic, but he is far too creative and original thinker to be surrendered to the vulgar stereotypes of his enemies, and I think we are gradually winning him back.
Okay, thank you, Eagleton. It's difficult to follow such a comprehensive overview of Marx as Terry has given, but I'll try. I think this week we have really been through what I consider some of the most obscene propaganda of the media over the last 3 years, where story after story has appeared about these terrible people on social welfare who are, we've saved, the country, we've now saved 600 million from these people who are claiming social welfare. And so emboldened do some of the more younger neoliberals get that in my college, UCD, we're now even having debates on should we abolish welfare altogether. The idea that we should even give the poor anything, it seems to be slipping onto the agenda. And then you pick up the Irish Times this morning and you got this slightly technical story, but nevertheless rather interesting story, where you find a Treasury Holdings owned by one John Ronan and what's the other man's name? Richard Barrett, salted away 20 million of their company to another private limited company they have, so that NAMA, the people of Ireland, would not get hold of it. They salted away 20 million and cost themselves 100,000. This is a little bit technical, but it's the same deal that the Quinn family did. They move away some of their assets and swap it for a computer, just to keep it away from the greedy Irish people who might want to take their assets back. But more intriguingly is as you plough through this legalistic story, NAMA, i.e. the people of Ireland, gave these people 103 million. So we gave them 103 million, they salt away their money, By the way, we're also paying them 800 million to run the National Concert Hall, and they owe us 2 billion in debt, right? That's one of the reasons why we pay all this debt. Now, you think about that. That is really amazing. And then you look at the stuff on social welfare, and you find it's lies. It is genuine lies. Any study done, and even studies by the Department of Social Protection, indicate that only 1% of social welfare claimants have engaged in fraud. That is the actual figure. Now, when I even say that, that sounds a bit shocking. How have we gone through a week of constant propaganda against the poor, and very little is said about this sort of thing? And why am I starting with that? I'm starting with that because generally when people come to left-wing meetings and you hear very simple left-wing points, which is that why are we paying 90 billion to the banks when we could, for example, be paying for our primary school system? Why are we, for example, on the 31st of March, paying out 3.1 billion, isn't it, to bondholders, which just so happens to be the total cost of the primary education budget? And most people agree with that. Most people agree with that statement, that it is wrong to pay bondholders while the money that could be gone into fund the primary school system. Most people agree with that with their hearts, but when they leave this room and go to the switch on the local television sets and find somebody in a suit who's called an economist, you'll be told you are unrealistic to believe that. And therefore, this is one of the issues that fascinates me, how, if you like, with our heart we can understand certain questions, but when we try to think it through practically, it is unrealistic in terms of the current system. The last bit is never added in, the current system. And that really even affects people on the left. In other words, you think that I think these things are worth advancing, but probably it's not going to happen. It's going to happen in a different type of society. So I want to start by asking is, what's the basis of this realism? This realism that infects all of us in many ways as we listen to the media and the like. And this, as a sociologist, when you find this sort of pattern of thinking where you're almost compelled to say, that's a bit extreme to say we will slash the income of the rich and give to the poor, there's a structure in society. A structure is something that constrains our thinking and indeed constrains our deeds. And Marx, I think, is absolutely crucial in starting to understand that structure, what we in the 60s used to call the system. How does the system work? How does it get people to think and define certain things as realistic and other things as unrealistic? When we start to think about the system, the first approximation most people start with is the problem of the system is bad individuals. Every revolt in history, or most revolts in history in the past, often start in the pattern of bad King John and good King Richard. If we replace good King Richard with bad King John, things will improve. In modern parlance, if we stop our country being run by greedy people and put in decent people, something might actually change for the better. The only problem with that view is that even when you put in near saints, like for example Nelson Mandela, who served decades in prison, comes out, it becomes the key figure in South Africa, it doesn't seem to change. It doesn't seem to matter, even if you put in a good person, the same pattern of privatization, subsidies for the wealthy, continues in South Africa as much as in capitalist America. So simply replacing bad people with good people doesn't appear to work. And therefore people often go to the other extreme of believing that, and this is increasingly a feature, certainly as I do meetings around the country, of believing that at the heart of the capitalist system there is a command and control system. A sort of conspiracy of either the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Bilderberg Group, that, if you like, somehow are in control and manage to keep us down by these devious means. And the problem with that argument is, if you actually believe that, well, you have a little logical problem. If they are in control of so many things, how the hell are we ever going to get rid of them? If they predict everything, even our ability to revolt and suppress that revolt, how are we ever going to be able to get rid of them? And moreover, it doesn't appear, particularly at the moment, they are as united as they might like to be. And therefore, we come to Marx's attempt to get at the essence of this system, which, as Terry says, is now being named as capitalism. And in a nutshell, I mean, what I think is at the essence of Marx is an understanding of capitalism as the result of the alienated abilities of humankind. It is not simply some great centre of power. It is our labour which has been taken from us, which takes on an alienated form, which in turn comes to oppress us. And that very simple, not simple, rather complicated way of understanding capitalism, you get glimpses of it when you listen to the radio stations constantly at the moment. The simple statement, bondholders are concerned about Greece. Now that's an interesting statement, because we don't know the names of these bondholders. Do they have families? Do they play golf? Where do they live? We define them only in terms of a thing called a bond. And it's the fact they hold a bond which gives them concern. And therefore what we're living in is a world where we are dominated by something called the markets, which seem to have a life of their own, anonymous, impersonal, divorced from general activities, but somehow in control of something called economics. And I think any attempt to understand that, if you wish to understand that system and how it emerges, I think you need to return to Marx. And therefore this meeting, I think, if you like, is an indication of the growing interest in Marx's ideas. Let me just really stress three features of the system, if you like, in terms of that type of understanding that is at the heart of this system. The first thing I think we can say about capitalism, pretty obvious statement, is that it is an exploitative system. It is based on exploitation. I won't take too long in explaining it. I mean, if you take Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, total wealth of each of them, 38 billion, 40 billion. The theory that they have invented something and are rewarded 40 billion, it doesn't really stack up. I mean, maybe they invented something 20 years ago, but why are they still getting 40 billion? The idea they're getting 40 billion because they're risk takers, I don't think you can really argue that anymore, given the intervention of the state after Wall Street. And therefore, we can only conclude that Bill Gates' wealth, or Warren Buffett's, has something to do with human labour, the fact that tens of thousands of people across the world are producing the computers and the various entities that Buffett and Gates control. But here we have a problem. The problem is that the people who make this money for Gates, there's no whip, there's no compulsion, there's nobody threatening us with violence to extract this money from us. In many ways, the sort of ideology of the system, which stresses its freedom, has an important element of truth. You are actually free under capitalism to sell your labour to Bill Gates or not to sell Bill Gates. So therefore the question is, if this society is so free, and it's not apparently built on the compulsion of the whip and violence, how do they actually exploit us? And that simple question, how do they do it? How do they extract so much wealth, is crucial in terms of the understanding of Marx. Because when we look behind the ideology of freedom, freedom of choice, the great term of the neoliberals, some problems immediately emerge. The freedom of capital is vast compared to the freedom of labour. If you take, for example, the Carlyle Corporation as a random example, worth 150 billion, more than the size of the Irish economy. It is an asset, a private equity company that holds assets. Its capital is free to morph into factories, real estates, to shift across the world. It has an immense freedom. The freedom of a worker is confined to, well, will I sell my labour to Bill Gates, or to Warren Buffett, or to the owners of Carlyle? So the freedom within capitalism is very much for capital as against actual labour. And when we look at the freedom of labour, it is a freedom simply to decide not do I sell my labour or not, but only to which capitalist do I sell my labour. And here I've made a small slippage that, if you like, means that I'm affected slightly by the way economists think. I don't actually sell labour. Most of us do not sell labour. There's not a thing called labour which I take along a little box and hand to the capitalist, and we enter a free contract, and that's an equal contract. What I actually sell, because I'm a human being, we're all human beings, I actually sell my labour power. I sell my energy, my creativity, my ability to work with nature and produce something new and valuable. And because I am selling something that's not elastic, my creativity, that's not horror of horror in modern society measurable, what I actually get in exchange is a limited quantity of money, and that limited quantity of money does not compensate for the value that I produce through my labour power. A rather simple theory, a very elegant theory, but from that base, from actually like that distinction between what you work for part of the day, creating the value of your wage, and the surplus labour you give to capital, is the basis of wealth. And that old theory, it seems to me, fell down or was attacked in universities over the last 10, 20 years in the name of postmodernism, in the idea that, for example, it's not simply based on reality, it's the ability to move money around the world through mythologies and through imagery. That simple statement was forgotten. And therefore, the basis of capitalism is that ability to exploit labour power. Max Weber wrote an interesting, the other sociologist who often put up against Marx, an interesting argument about the question of slavery and wage labour. It's not the case that, if you like, capitalism has any principled objection to having slaves. It is conceivable that at a certain point, if you had commodity production, you might in fact be able to employ slaves rather than wage labour. But there are some disadvantages to having slaves. What do you do with them when the market goes down? When there's no work, what do you do with a slave? You still have to feed them. How do you deal with this terrible problem of bringing up children? Are we going to have male and female slaves and have to have, if you like, families of slaves to help the production process? And through this argument, Weber showed, not a Marxist, that in fact wage labour, the ability to pay people for a proportion of their labour and keep the rest as a surplus, is a much more productive basis for profit and leaves the basis for tremendous expansion within capitalism. The second point Marx focused on, I just want to deal with a little bit, is how modern society, far from the ideology of neoliberalism being a highly individualistic society, it is in one sense, but modern capitalism is a society where we are more socially dependent on each other than in any previous society. The fact that, for example, still the case, a lot of people on the planet work as self-sufficient farmers, but in terms of the industrialized West, to get a simple cup of coffee means relying on the labour of people in Somalia, of merchant seamen, of traders in New York exchanges and so on. We are a much more socially integrated population than at any previous society. Now the question is, how do you organise that social integration? And you've got different options in history. You can have, for example, a tribal leader who determines the division of labour and how society is organised, or you could have a free economy where people decide it democratically. What capitalism does, this is what Marx gets the essence of it, it is a system whereby social integration is organised through commodity exchange. The basis of our life is exchanging commodities, and through that commodity exchange we actually interact and eventually produce in front of us the coffee or the simple items we need. Now, what do we mean by that? What we mean by that then is the basis of how we organise society is determined by goods that can be exchanged. But we have no control over those goods. They can be exchanged for different needs. Some people have needs for yachts, for Botox. Other people have needs for water purification tablets. The basis of the system is that those needs are looked after depending on commodity exchange and depending on the ability of people to buy and sell. And what that means is capitalism has a tremendous dynamism. This is where Terry's absolutely right. Marx, in many ways, praises capitalism. It has a tremendous dynamism. It has an ability to expand, to change, to accumulate wealth and change our lives in a way that no other system before that. Think, for example, of the difference between a feudal lord and the Carlyle Group. When I wrote a book a year ago, the Carlyle Group was worth 85 billion. I look at the Financial Times today, they're worth 130 billion. 150 billion, actually, 150 billion. Why don't they stop? Why don't the owners take a rest? I mean, they've got it. I mean, how many holidays can you need? Why don't they take a rest? And here we come to the central issue in terms of capitalism and its difference with feudalism. Under feudalism, the limits of exploitation, the limits of wealth creation is, as was famously stated, it was the size of the feudal lord's belly. There was only so much the feudal lord could consume, and therefore only so much exploitation and, if you like, the drive to accumulate was enforced on people. Under capitalism, there are no limits. And therefore we live in a system that has this extraordinary dynamic of accumulating, as Marx put it, for accumulating's sake. Or put it in a slightly different language of David Harvey, the basis of the system is the self-expansion of capitalism. the great myth, the self-expansion of capital, the great myth of neoliberalism is that somehow capital is there to serve the consumer. That somehow we as autonomous individuals, we're going to be served by large corporations. That's not the basis of capitalism. The basis of capitalism is the self-expansion of capital that is accidentally, rather than essentially, related to human need. And because of that, you end up with a system that is profoundly alienated, where human powers, if you like, escape the control of individuals, and therefore we end up with statements about how the markets will show their concern about us at the moment. Marx grasped that philosophically at a very young age, writing in, for example, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, influenced by people like Feuerbach. He looked at a dynamic whereby people, in terms of relations to religion, it's not, as Feuerbach put it, people that create a God. It's not that God creates a people, it is people create a God. All the qualities of God, as Feuerbach put it, of loving, of intelligence, of creativity, are human qualities, but we take these qualities, transfer them onto a God, and in turn become demeaned. Marx took that simple idea of alienation, transferred it out of the sphere of religion, and in fact in many ways Marx's argument is not with religion, and transferred it to the sphere of economics. That all our abilities, our creativities are transferred onto capital, which escapes our control, which then becomes this wonderfully creative energy. Think of all the sort of nonsense that goes on these days about the role of the entrepreneur, this new hero of modern Irish society. And we in turn become demeaned, and we must beg and grovel and ask the entrepreneur, will you please take a tax break to send your children to private schools? Will you please take an extra swimming pool? But please give us jobs. This is the dynamic of capitalism. We create wealth, which in turn comes to oppress us. Simply by Marx. But what he does then, this is absolutely crucial, Marx was not an academic. Marx did not simply analyse capitalism in order to, if you like, outline its contours. His primary purpose was to overthrow it. And here I think a point that Terry makes is also particularly important. How do we overthrow capitalism? If we describe it as such, how do we actually overthrow capitalism? And to this day, one of the dominant methods that people think of overthrowing capitalism is to think in terms of a utopia or a good idea. That if we as individuals can come up with a good idea and propose that and develop a picture of a better society, somehow or other the mass of people will follow that idea and it will bring about change. Now Marx was profoundly against the idea of utopia. And that means, as Terry indicated, the notion, often the charge often levelled against socialists, that we want a perfect society. No, we don't. I'd hate to live in a perfect society. We simply want a better world, and we do not agree with the concept of perfection in terms of human society. But it also means that the model of change is not simply the masses, that terrible expression, the masses following a utopian ideal that has been worked out in advance. Marx's method is rather to look for real contradictions. And this is absolutely crucial to how he sees the overthrow of capitalism. What do you mean by a real contradiction? If I say the wall is black and you say it's white, we have an intellectual contradiction. We have a clash of ideas. But for Marx, a real contradiction is the different forces that hold together a unity in any society. And that is what he refers to. This emphasis is on dialectics. And it's very difficult, often particularly because the way subjects are taught in universities and the way the media is, to grasp the importance of dialectics and contradictions. If you look, for example, at the so-called scientist Einstein, that you give people a personality test, and you're either an introvert or an extrovert, depending on the scale. You do little figures, and you end up introvert. Why couldn't you be an introvert and an extrovert? Why couldn't you be a contradictory character? Why couldn't society hold together a contradictory unity? And why couldn't we look at that contradictory unity to see what is the forces that will bring about change? And this is where Marx, I think, is really revolutionary in how he begins to understand capitalism. Because what he predicts from the word go is there are inherent contradictions in the system that give us the possibility of overthrowing it. Not that it will self-deconstruct or self-destruct, but will give us the possibilities of overthrowing it. And what are some of those contradictions? Most basically, The contradiction, you look at what's happening in Greece today and how vivid and real it is, the contradiction between the incessant drive to accumulate, to self-expand capital, the restless energy to accumulate profit, to reinvest in industry, to make more profit, one drive, but at the same time, in order to do that, you have to squeeze the living standards of working people. How many times have we heard the discourse of how do we cut costs for competitiveness? But if you're going to cut costs, you're going to cut the ability of people to buy the goods and services you're trying to produce in order to make a profit. And therefore, you look at Greece today and you say, how can they be so insane? I mean, how can they be so insane? They keep telling the Greek people, we are going to squeeze you and squeeze you. We want you to pay off that 130 billion debt. Surely they must know, the more they do that, the Greek people cannot buy the goods, their economy will go down the tubes, and they will not be able to pay the debt. So why do they keep on doing it? And they keep on doing it because that's the essence of capitalism. The drive to squeeze and squeeze, while at the same time trying to accumulate wealth. And that contradiction periodically explodes within the system. The second contradiction that periodically explodes within the system is if this is a system where the coordination of human society is made through commodity exchange, by definition, those people who produce commodities are uncoordinated. People make decisions about which commodities that will be produced without reference to anybody else. And therefore, if you're an Irish building boss, you might decide to have a massive boom in housing, but you didn't coordinate with the people who supply the land, the people who supply the labour, the people who supply the raw materials. And periodically, the booms are choked off and the system goes into a crisis. But lastly, just to refer to a point that Terry made, the biggest contradiction of capitalism is that capitalism is a dynamic force that pushes forward the human potential and our levels of productivity. Even with all its chaos, it still pushes this forward. But nevertheless, what it does is it tries to entrap, encase, and push back those productive forces. We had a little march in Dublin last week about the attempt by the European Union to enforce, particularly on the young, laws which stop you file sharing. We have wonderful technology that allows us to share files and music and art for free, but they can't handle it. They cannot handle the idea that something could be communal. They cannot handle the idea that science is moving forward at a tremendous pace at the moment, but they have to insist on something called intellectual property. I mean, it baffles me in my university to be brought before my university authorities and told, please sign this agreement where we can claim intellectual property over any idea that you produce in this university. With all due respect to sociology, I don't think they'll be looking for the sociology ideas. But I think maybe if you're in physics or biomedicine, they want to grab it and hold it and turn it into private property. And therefore what we find is a society that is growing and developing and creating new possibilities for human beings, held back by the relations of production, the relations of private property. And all of this, and I'll finish on this, creates, in a very general and abstract sense, the prospect of revolution. The most damning distortion of Marx was somehow the idea that Marx was a determinist. That Marx thought economics is what changed society. You simply have to follow economic laws, encourage the growth of the productive forces in society. Marx's key idea was that human beings make history, but not in conditions of their own choosing. And I think we've arrived at a point in history where the contradictions are immense within capitalism. They're very visible to most of us. But the question now is, can we organise, get together, follow the people of Egypt, the people of Greece, and bring revolution to this country and take society forward?